Here is Juliette and me, Clément. We are here to talk about our project we did last year, where I participated in AIRE. We worked on investigating the bioproduction potential of mini cells. So first, let me start by introducing what AIRE is. It stands for International Genetically Engineered Machine, and it's indeed the world's biggest synthetic biology competition. So for example, last year, it involved 352 teams of around 10 students around the world. And the goal of this competition is to solve problems at a local scale using synthetic biology. And we will show you a bit afterward what it is. And to give an estimation, it was around a 10-month project. So here, first, I would like to thank all our team members. Everybody was super involved, and we were a team of students from very various backgrounds, a very international team. And everybody was involved and has their own role to play in the team. And also we were glad to have our PIs and advisor that helped us a lot along the journey. So first, we started by reflecting about how to solve a local problem. And we came with this idea of not solving a local issue, but solving a global issue locally. And therefore, we chose to take into consideration 3 aspects which were very important for every team member, which were sustainability, social well-being, and safety. So we organized the whole project around these 3 points. With this question, how can we engineer bacteria to perform affordable and safe and thematic bioproduction?
So to work on that question, we decided to choose one organism called mini cells. So first, it's really interesting to know that there's a lot of names for mini cells, such as vesicle, particle, or also simple cells, which makes it a bit complicated to look into it when you go through literature. But basically, these organisms are nano to micro-sized bacteria, and they are produced when there's an abnormal division of the bacterium, which lead to this kind of round-shaped product with no chromosomal DNA. So they are not able to divide, to grow, or to replicate, but they still have the whole machinery, and they are metabolically active, and so supposedly able to produce proteins. So what happened is that in a normal bacteria, so on the left, the normal division is that you have this round-shaped bacteria and a Z ring, which is circling the bacteria at the very middle. And this is dividing the bacteria in 2 equal parts, leading to 2 bacterium of the same shape. And so the 2 of them have this chromosomal DNA, leading to the division and replication and so on. But for the mini cell, what happened is that this ring is not well positioned for some reason that we will explain later, but this led to the formation of a normal bacterium and a small one called mini cells without the chromosomal DNA, but still, as I explained, the whole machinery. And we are able to produce these mini cells in the lab by modifying the bacteria. So there is many ways to do it, but the 2 main that were mainly used in labs were by playing with the bacterial division system, either with the minoperon, which is responsible for the formation of this ring and the well positioning. And so for this, we got 2 strains from one old agent team from Wild and from Ariel Linder. So that helped us to characterize, and Clément is going to explain it afterwards. And the other way is to overexpress a protein called FTAZ, also responsible for the circling of the bacteria. So either of this way can help us produce mini cells.
So to do our study, we first tried to characterize well mini cells, since it wasn't very well explained in the literature what they were. The two techniques we used mostly were microscopy and FACS analysis, which is fluorescent cell sorting. On the left side, you can see on the image here a time lapse we made, and the little dots there are the mini cells that we can clearly see under microscopy. So it was a very good tool to really observe the behavior of how mini cells are produced. And here on the right side, you can see a graph, which is a distribution of the FACS machine. And it gives clearly 3 different gates that we can distinguish here, which are the normal cells here, the debris, they are in green, and the mini cells lies in between the two. But you can see that it's very difficult to differentiate them from the debris already. What these techniques helped us also to see is, you can see here on those microscopy images, that the little dots corresponding to mini cell can also produce fluorescence. It means that they are metabolically active and able to produce GFP. And with the FACS, we also were able to approximate the ratio of mini cell over mother cell. And it was a bit lower than expected, but we can see here that we already have around between 10 and 20% of the culture that is mini cell in the end. So it was a good result. So the idea then is to engineer these bacteria to produce mini cells. How can we do that? As Juliette explains, we have 2 techniques. So here, the first construct that you can see is to overexpress the mean operand with a heat-inducible promoter. And the second option here is to overexpress FTSC by adding of APTG. So if you add APTG, it will trigger the lac operand, produce the TCL molecule, and then trigger the production of FTSC. And we went along with this option. So first, we have this construct to synthesize mini cell, and then inside the mini cell, you will have this second construct here that is able to produce a molecule of interest. So by adding arabinose, you will trigger the production here of this enzyme of interest, which is TMM, for example. And this will be inside the mini cell and activated because the mini cell has everything to do enzymatic production.
And so with this construct, we decided to test the production of 2 enzymes that was also in the field of trying to find and solve local problems. The first one was to produce Taq polymerase. So this is an enzyme that is really commonly used in lab, especially for PCR reactions. So in times of COVID crisis, it was really crucial for small labs all over the world to get access to this enzyme. And because the supply chains were sometimes broken, especially at the beginning of the pandemic, we thought that tackling this problem would be very interesting. And the second one, TMM, so it's a pigment, indigo, so a blue pigment, and it's widely used in the textile industry, especially for gene dyeing, and it's really polluting. And as you're going to see later on the website we coded, this was a main part of the story of why we chose it and why we thought it could be interesting to study it and to produce it at a local and safer scale. So first, with Taq polymerase, what we did was that we were given a plasmid containing this Taq gene of interest, and we needed to transform our bacteria with this plasmid. And then we purified the sample just to have the mini cells that were supposed to contain this plasmid. And we realized a PCR and then a gel to verify whether or not our mini cells were able to express this Taq, and we decided to amplify So what we did was that we had our mini cells containing the plasmid, and we centrifuged it just to have the tack supposedly in the liquid above. And with this, so it was supposedly tack, we decided to amplify a fragment we knew, and then to test different concentration of this liquid above. And what we saw is that there were some bend corresponding to the fragment that we aimed to amplify. And so that was an encouraging result, but it still needs to be replicated because, as you see, the bend are quite transparent. So yeah, repeating these experiments would be the first key, and then some quality control, for example, comparing to industrial Taq polymerase to see the difference of quality. And the second experiment was with indigo production. And for this one, we had to create a plasmid. So we used CPEC, standing for circular polymerase extension cloning, which is a method a bit similar to polymerase PCR assembly reaction. And we cloned this TMM into plasmid. And what we did here is the results of the assembled plasmid. And again, we're trying to go quickly as we have many things to present, but we did add these two bands as highlighted in purple. So the next step, and we saw visually also that the colonies were blue, which was a really good sign. So the next step would be to sequence just to make sure that this TMM section was well included in the plasmids.
So now that we have all the engineering done, we wanted to really get interested into the bioproduction process. And therefore, we had the idea of creating this bioreactor that you can see here on the screen, which is a machine that we designed and built in order to grow the mini cell and produce the enzyme of interest. So here, the concept is very basic. We have two tanks able to grow bacteria inside, and you can transfer liquids from both tanks to another. And this is very versatile, and indeed it's very simple but very efficient. You can see here the first container with a 3D printed piece with all the sensors inside in order to maintain the growth condition. The heating system here, and so these tubes are directly linked to the pumps. And everything was controlled here in the panel using an Arduino controller. So we were able to really grow our bacteria and contain it inside a machine that does every manipulation by itself. So no manipulation is needed by the experimentator. And it also limits the formation of biofilm thanks to the transferring of liquids.
And so now that we have thought and designed this bioreactor, one main question was, how can we separate the mini cells from the mother cell? Because obviously we don't want our final product to be mixed with bacteria that can replicate, especially if we want to use the final product for outside applications. So first, there are two different strategies that can be used to do this purification. Oh, one being, is my...
Go on, you can repeat. There's a little issue with the micro. So
from the slide before?
Yes, just before.
Okay. Okay, so now that we have this bioreactor, one question was, how can we separate the mini cells from the mother cells? Because we don't want bacteria at the end with our final product replicating while we want to be able to use it outside. So at the moment, there are two main strategies for purification of mini cells. The first one being centrifugations. So it's rotating at very high speed the sample so that there will be a pellet, so an accumulation of the bacterial cells at the bottom. And on the liquid, you will have the mini cells. So we will just get the liquid at the end. And the other strategy is using antibiotics. So antibiotics will inhibit the growth of the bacteria and so target bacteria replicating. And so because it's not the case of mini cells, you will end up with mini cells. And one good strategy that was widely used, for example, by Drendy in 2020, was to combine both methods, and the purity was actually higher than 99%, so it was really efficient. But if we want to use it in the bioreactor, it's not possible. First of all, because it's going to be too complicated and not by yourself at all to just take the sample and centrifuge it outside. And also because the use of antibiotics so wouldn't be Is it working?
No, it's working. And so the use of antibiotic wouldn't be
Yeah, thank you. So it wouldn't be that good of a choice because, so to select the bacteria with our constructs, we use some antibiotic resistance. So just adding one more antibiotic, especially with this whole antimicrobial resistance problem, is something we thought being very problematic. So after a discussion with Drendy, we've come up with the idea of using bacteriophages. So there are small viruses able to infect and replicate within bacteria. And we thought of why not using a phage that would be replication deficient. So instead of the phages that would, so once they infect the bacteria, some of them are able to replicate, and then after the cell bursts, they will just spread in the media and infect other bacteria and so on. But this one would be replication deficient. So we won't have phages everywhere in the media, just by modifying a terminase A, which is responsible for packing the phage DNA in a capsid. And we would also make this phage start the lysis of the cell by induction with a thermosensitive promoter, CI857. And so you will have to have a specific temperature to start the lysis of the cell, which will be really helpful to control, especially when you want the cell to lyse. And so we were nicely given a prophage that was replication deficient. We just needed to have its genome encoded in the mover cell. So what was going to happen is that we want the genome of this phage in the mover cells. So as explained in yellow, so that the mover cell will have it, but not the mini cells, because they don't have genome. And so the advantage would be that once we induce it, all the mover cells supposedly will die, but not the mini cells. So for that, we use P1 transduction to transfer the prophage genome into the mover cell. And to verify that, we did PCR using 2 primer spares, and we looked at the gel. So we targeted 2 regions, one in the genome of the bacteria and one in the supposedly genome inserted of the phage. So if it worked, we're supposed to see both bands, as it's the case for the purple boxes. And there was a problem for the lambda band in 2 of the strains, which we decided not to use. And then with the strains that were successful, we studied whether the bacteria were lysing after induction or not. And the encouraging result was that, so the induction corresponds to the vertical blue bar here, and then the purple and orange curve corresponds to the 2 strains. So the purple is the one not producing mini cells, and the orange producing mini cells with the lambda prophage inserted in the genome. And you can see that after induction and after an hour or 2, there is a decay of the OD corresponding to also to the growth of the bacteria, and it's almost none at the end of the experiment. But when we decided to broaden a bit the time, and so before we did 10 hours of studying the growth, and then hours, we see that there was a decay, but after 10 hours, there was a regrowth that could have potentially been linked to some defective prophages or some mutations. So this showed that our system was not fully biosafe, since you have this regrowth and so potential risk of having bacteria replicate. And so as you see, there was some leak in biosafety. And so from that point, we decided to study step by step our experiments and constructs and to identify the different risks, being the one in the bioreactor or the phages, to see how we could characterize them. And so from this, we associated a risk score. And we ended up with some ideas of control for the risk and some measures to avoid it. So yeah, biosafety was also a big part of this project.
So now that we have this complete pipeline of producing mini cell, killing the rest of the cells with the phages, and making the mini cell producing the enzyme, we wanted to know a bit more about how it works using a mathematical model. So the first step to find a good model was to really define what it should be doing. So we end up with 3 axioms, which are first the growth. A bacteria can double size in 20 minutes. Then the mini cell production, which is a bacteria of a certain size can just give a mini cell of a defined size and a smaller bacteria. And the division, which is when the bacteria is big enough, it can split in 2. And this is a wide branch of problems studied in biomathematics, which are growth fragmentation problem. So we want to simplify this problem because it's very complex. And what we have, it's summarized here in the left, it's partial differential equations with a functional term. So what the system is composed of is growth and mini cell production, which are transfer equation of mass, and growth, production, and division depend on the cell size, right? So the bigger the cell is, the higher the division rate will be, for example. And what we want the system to give, the model to give at the end is really the number of bacteria and mini cells, so that we can have an idea of how much mini cells were produced. So it's summarized here in the figure on the left. So for example, if you take, we want to separate to make it simpler, we want to separate the size space, because we have 2 space, the time and the size. So we will take the size space, the size of a bacteria, and we will make cuts to have different cluster of size. So if you are, for example, in the small cluster of size here, you can grow to a bigger size. And then when you are big, you have a higher probability to divide, for example, and then get smaller and reach a smaller cluster of size. So with that simplification, we had this model done and we could do the computation. So here it's with an algorithm what we expect to have. And you see that the intuition wants that the ratio mini cells over mother cells tend to be constant in time. And this is indeed what we observed with our model. So we clearly see that in time, the mother cell mini cell ratio remain constant, which is the more mother cell you have, the more mini cell you will have. And this was tested with no experimental data because we hadn't experimental data, but with mathematical fitting from the model created by Hall and Wake. We observed that our model tends, even with the approximation, to fit the expected curve. So we could guess that the model is a great approximation. So that was it for the scientific part, but this project was not only about pure science. We wanted to put it into a more concrete context. And as we explained, we triggered a very actual problem, which is the polluting textile industry. You can see that it's a big polluter. And indeed, for example, if you take indigo, the blue pigment, it's produced using petroleum. And in our project, we used our system to, out of bacteria, produce pigments that will be directly used to tint textile without any chemicals. And you can see the result here, the blue string. In order to help us, we also asked different experts from various fields to give us their insight and their feedback on the project, which was very insightful.
We also did many collaboration with other IGM teams from all over the world, such as participating to the Fête de la Science in Paris to explain our project and even what was DNA and how do we get it to kids. And we also did a really fascinating project with IGM Board that were in fact the winner of 2020 competition to develop and standardize protocols for remote echo, which is basically automized high throughput golden gate assembly, which is a method to clone parts of interest into genetic constructs.
And also we did a lot about communication. So we had to produce 2 little videos. You can see some nice screenshots here. And a website as well that we can go through quickly. We developed this entire website so that it's accessible and remain very, so we want it to be the more accessible possible and the more precise the communication. So we lied all our protocols and all our experimental data is in there so that we can leave a lead for the next people that want to work over mini cells and go through our project to really learn more about what we did. So if you want to have a look to the website, I hope that you would enjoy looking at it.
Thank you so much, Juliette and Clément.
Yeah,
we're just gonna
just
conclude.
Okay, perfect.
Just in a minute.
No, good.
So to conclude on the main thing, the main findings of this 10-month project, which was really huge, was that we estimated qualitatively the mini cell sizes, and we had some approximation of the ratio mini cell over cells. We also constructed successfully new inducible plasmids for mini cell and enzymatic production. And we did demonstrate this production capacity of the mini cells. A bioreactor was also developed and was functional, given really encouraging results that could be further than automatized. And we also implemented a pipeline for simulating the production of mini cells. And so this was a good reflection on our approach to the whole project and to the problematic, but also on our methods and the results, and to develop critical thinking on what could have been improved or not. And so for the further perspective of the project, so there's 2 main things. The first one is a review on mini cells, which is actually ongoing because we noticed that there was a noticeable lack of literature, especially review on mini cells to concatenate everything. That could be then in the future really useful. And the other part is an article following our whole project on the hardware applied to mini cells. But for that, we will need many experiments to replete and having replicates so that it's going to be a really strong article, and especially in the characterization of mini cells. And thank you for your attention.
Our first roundtable about the impact of advertisements on citizens with the question, can science enlighten regulatory decisions? And for this, yes, Mehdi Khamassi is connected. He's going to be the moderator of this session with me. And we have also our guests. But first, I think Mehdi has a few words for introducing the topic, right?
Yes, hello. So I'm sharing my slides and then I'll be able to start. So here, yeah. Can you see the slides?
Yes.
Absolutely.
Great. So hello, everyone. Thank you very much to the organizers for setting up this whole workshop, the different roundtables, and proposing me to participate. And so I'm going to introduce this roundtable entitled Impact of Advertisement on Citizens. Can Science Enlighten Regulatory Decisions? And so for this roundtable, we are lucky to have great speakers that accepted to participate. So first, Hilke Plasman, who is Associate Professor in Decision Neuroscience and Marketing at INSEAD. Then we'll hear about Celia Zolinsky, who's Professor in Private Law and Criminal Sciences at Université Panthéon-Sorbonne. And then Mariam Chama, who's Doctor in Cognitive Neuroscience and Executive Advisor at DITP, which is a department under the French Prime Minister, taking care of some propositions of regulations, but she'll talk much better about this. And as moderators, there will be Camille Lakhifi, my colleague here, who's a PhD student in behavioral sciences, cognitive science at the High Health Authority and the Brain Institute in Paris. And myself, Mehdi Khamassi, I'm a researcher at the CNRS in cognitive science. So the idea is to talk a bit about advertisement. So one process within our societies and asking questions, ethical questions, and how scientists can contribute to this debate, or about its impact, how to improve it, what are the problems and questions, and how we can improve it. So first, a bit of background. So when we talk about advertisement, people often confound it with just the fact to give information about some product. But classically, people, when they talk about advertisement, they mean the purchase of a space for advertisement in a mass medium. So that means when you print a few hundred flyers for a theater event or a concert, something that does not is not counted within this definition. And when they talk about mass medium, they talk about advertisement on internet, television, press, posters, radio, or cinema. And so I'm taking this from the report on advertisement and ecological transition by Géraud Guibert and Thierry Libert in 2020. Second, and that's important elements to take into account to understand the context, there are a lot of estimations about how many ads we're exposed to on a weekly basis. And I'm giving here a lower bound of the current estimations, which is at least 6,000 ads per week, which is a quite high number. And when you combine this with measures of the concentration of the advertising market in many countries, but in particular in France, and here I'm showing the figures that are from the Brain Union in France, which is an official organism with many companies who are advertising, who participate. And the figure from 2015 is like 80% of the total investment in advertising in France is done by 672 companies among the 21,866 companies that do advertising, which is itself among the approximately 3 million companies in France. And so this gives me an opportunity to give one example of a message that scientists can give, and something I wrote in an article in French media Libération in 2020, which is with this number of exposures to ads every week and this level of concentration, that means there is a probability higher than 99% of being exposed more than 55 times in the week to at least one advert. And with this, as a researcher in cognitive science, and especially working on brain mechanisms of conditioning, I can say that it's a sufficient number to produce a conditioning effect. So then this knowledge coming from science supposed to then make people think, and citizens decide whether that's acceptable or not. That's a decision that belongs to each citizen, and politicians to decide whether some regulations are needed or not. So that's one example in this context. Another example of things that are of messages that are diffused by researchers is a question about the effect of advertising on obesity, for example, and child obesity in particular. So a report by Santé Publique France, again in 2020, noted that more than 50% of the ads for food sold by kids are selling products with low Nutri-scores, so like D and E Nutri-score items. And moreover, there are a lot of research doing on this and trying to estimate what could be the effect of advertising on child obesity. And I'm citing here a meta-analysis from 2009, which estimates that actually, so that an estimation in the US, child obesity could be reduced by up to 1/3 by limiting TV ads for food. So again, this analysis of the effects, analysis of the figures leads to a fact that can then be discussed. It can be then to decide what regulations are needed. Now, I think it's important nowadays to pay a lot of attention, in particular to digital advertising. It's known that there's an increased proportion of digital ads at the expense, for example, of advertising in newspapers, printed newspapers. And in the last 2 years with the pandemics, this increase has even seen an acceleration. There are some papers in the economics of advertising that found that combination of different advertising strategies, like you combine internet advertising with TV advertising and so on, makes advertising even more efficient. And there's a lot of research done these days with, for example, fake ads on internet and measuring the behavior of people and whether it has an impact or not. And many papers show that ads on internet can be sometimes visible, sometimes not, so they can be unconsciously perceived, but are still efficient. So what can we do within this context? And here are some of the questions we would like to raise during this roundtable and discuss, and with our invited speakers, but also with all the participants. And feel free to write again questions, and then we'll repeat your questions to the speakers. So some of the questions, in particular, related to digital advertising. So are there issues with the fact that on internet there can be even more targeted advertising, personalized advertising? The fact that there's data collection, you can directly measure whether people clicked on some ad or not. The fact that there's a lot of people are talking more and more about attention capture with pop-ups and many things to or endless news feed and what this produces in terms of behavior of people, maintaining people attentive on different websites and making them spend more time than maybe what they would like to do. And in particular, dark patterns is also a big question, and something which I hope Celia will talk more, but it seems like it's in the process of being regulated at the European level. So when we talk about dark patterns, we talk about a way of organizing the interface to make people make decisions that are in favor of the person who did this website. So for example, making it more difficult to refuse cookies than to accept it is considered a dark pattern. Or another example we had in mind is, for example, when the button that one has to check to unsubscribe to a service. So people would think classically you check to subscribe to a service like a newsletter, but sometimes you have to check to unsubscribe, which is not intuitive. So that can also be considered a dark pattern. And there are many others. So what can we do? And in particular, what scientists can do with their different disciplines in behavioral sciences, neuroscience, law, marketing. So can they help develop citizens' critical thinking by informing citizens about what we know about the mechanisms and the impact of advertising? Can we help lawyers and decision makers make new regulatory decisions and laws? And Celia in particular, Zolinsky, who's professor in law and has contributed to different committees like the National Committees on Digital Ethics, can, I hope, help us. Can we help advertisers themselves make more ethical ads? Because sometimes the advertisers themselves are not aware that there's an ethical problem with one way or another of doing advertising. And for example, I know that Hilke Plasman has contributed to a report for the government a few years ago, also informing that some products, the shape of some products could be confounded by kids between a toxic product and something that is drinkable. And so can be one way of informing and helping improve those products. But there are also questions and ethical questions for the scientists themselves. When are there conflicts of interest? And so when what we produce as knowledge can help increase even further the efficiency of advertising, and can we detect it? Is it a problem? Or when are we allowed to speak or not to speak with our expertise, and to which extent is it our expertise, or we know at least sufficient knowledge from a general discipline to talk about some effects? It's a very difficult question, non-trivial. So we hope that this roundtable is the opportunity to discuss about all these things. So I don't know if Hilke is already connected or not. If you are.
Yes, of course.
Yes, I'm here.
So hello, Hilke. Thank you very much for accepting to participate and joining us. And so it would be great to hear from you first.
I think you have the right to share your screen in case you want to share anything, but...
Yes, I would love to share. So I guess you invited me a bit also. So maybe let me first introduce myself. My name, can you hear me actually?
Yeah,
yes, yeah,
well.
perfect. So my name is Hilke Plasman. I'm a professor of decision neuroscience at INSEAD, in INSEAD's marketing area. I'm also a principal investigator at the Paris Brain Institute at the ICM. So I do a lot of research in the area of decision making with a specific focus on consumer decision making. I mean, I'm not, so I'm interested in explaining consumer behavior, so why people make certain decisions or why not. And in most of my studies, I'm using tools and theories from neuroscience together, specifically fMRI, but also hormones more lately. Also, I'm actually specifically interested in health decisions. So why are we actually not good at making healthy choices? So I'm trying to help consumers to make better decisions, something that's called transformative consumer research. Or also why are they not good at making financial decisions? And I try to, get ideas from neuroscience on the underlying mechanisms of why that is. And so use a multitude of methods, but I'm interested not in necessarily understanding the brain, I'm interested in understanding behavior. So with that, I share, I guess, some interest specifically with Mariam that I perceive myself as a behavioral scientist, not as a neuroscientist per se. And then, so obviously, so INSEAD is one of the top international business schools in the world, located amongst others in Fontainebleau. So we follow the American system. So in addition to my research, I also teach, and I do teach a class on how businesses can actually leverage neuroscience. And I think it's fun. So first of all, thank you to be invited for the session. It's fun to think about it. I'm not too much of an expert in advertising from a research perspective, much more from a teaching perspective. That's why I was also a bit struggling with what we actually mean in this roundtable with advertising, because it comes in a lot of ways, in a lot of flavors. I'm thankful to Mehdi that he also emphasized its economic importance, right? So I think thinking of, oh, we're just gonna not have advertising and we're going to regulate it and we're going to forbid it is a bit naive to think, right? So I'm obviously, trying to be a bit provocative to have a good discussion, right? So to maybe, take the other position that some of you will take. Because, it's, as Mehdi was saying, it's a big chunk of the French GDP, which is not really growing, right? So we also have to think about its importance for the economy at large. It also gives a lot of jobs, right? So last year, there were roughly 150,000 people employed in that industry. We don't want to put them necessarily out of a job, I think, right? And also, so again, advertising comes in all sorts of forms, and it comes also through different media, right? So today we are at 50% of digital media in France and not TV advertising anymore. Which has some advantages and disadvantages, I would say. A lot of companies, so going back to the idea of economic growth, when you think of startups, that I think at least Macron wants to foster, because it's good to have innovation and to grow. A lot of them work on an advertising model, right? So the business model is based on, it's for free, but you will, as in exchange, you will be seeing ads, right? So, and in some ways, so I like this was a bit of some consequence of the comment that Mehdi made. It's like, well, if we don't want advertising, when it's a consumer's choice, we can just go for the not for free version, but we obviously don't want to do that, right? So I do share concerns about data privacy, right? Specifically for big digital companies such as Facebook, where not much regulation has been done. And it's a very specific company also when you think of the power balance and the governance structure of that company. But it's not, it's similar to some other companies, obviously, right? So it's not the only case. And I also share concerns about child advertisement, right? So, but then, so I would love to see maybe the study that said in the US you could reduce this by 1/3 if you would stop TV advertising, because kids today, they don't watch TV anymore, they watch YouTube. And also I think there's a much bigger problem, right? So is that like it's the education at home and at school, what is actually healthy nutrition. And I mean, that was the most shocking part of being the part of this task force, was like that there was some sociology research, which I remember very well, on like this, so whether people understand the health messages from the government is something that Mariam would do, that is obviously a very important part of advertising, so to help people to understand not to engage in a disadvantageous behavior. So like this idea of manger bouger, or eating, I think, 5 fruits per day, people don't understand what this means. So they don't know what vegetables and fruits are. So they think of fries as, as vegetables. And they think, no, this can't be per day, this must be per month, right? And I think advertising is one contributing factor, but I think there are much bigger problems that we might be needing to attack first, right? So, so I think it's easy to blame this on one industry, but it's also important to think about what is actually the real cause of this problem, right? So again, this is to play devil's advocate. I want to wrap up my little introduction with sharing just some slides on what neuromarketing is, because I guess that's why you guys also invited me. So this is actually stuff that I teach to my MBA students. Let me now share my screen. I need to so I need to set this up. Just give me 1 second. How much time do I have left? Just that I know.
I think if you could make it in 10 minutes so that we can still have time for discussion, that would be great.
Perfect. Yeah, no, it will be less than that. Yeah, I thought that. Yeah. So this is actually here. This is how my journey in this field actually started. So this is my brain when I was a PhD student.
Yeah, perfect. Now I see your screen. Thanks.
Okay,
sorry.
Perfect, yeah. And so I was interested in how we encode preferences for products that are identical, but people have so think of a good way to think of this is a beer, right? So in Germany, we have beers, lager beer, that is the same by law because we have the purity law. But there are a lot of different beer brands out there that essentially sell the same thing. And people have very strong preferences for one brand versus the other. They actually fight over. It's like, I'm like a française drinker and I'm a Kronenbourg drinker. I mean, in France, not so much, but in Germany, that translates much better. I was fascinated by this. And so this is when I started my research, what I thought. So that would be which is obviously naive, but this was also like in the year 2000, where I wanted to know like, oh, okay, so how can this be? So is there something that encodes, for example, preference for this product versus the other product? This is obviously not the case, but at this time, again, this is like ages ago. This says something about how old I am. I went to the medical school and I talked to the folks from the Brain Imaging Institute there, and they looked at me, right? And they said, young lady, we're medical doctors. We do research important things such as language and vision. Decision-making is not one of them, right? So they sent me away. I got a bit panicked because I wanted to do my dissertation on this topic. And so the PhD students among you can relate to that. But then 3 months later, the guys called me back and said, look, it's actually not such a stupid question. So let's look where preferences are encoded in the brain. And what role brands and branding is playing. So something that is not really related to the core product, right? But that nevertheless is an important feature for all of us when we choose products. And yeah, so, and this was kind of my start to this field, right? So, and it turns out, obviously, this is not how you see this in this picture here. It's much more complicated. There's a network of brain areas that are encoding the value of an item. So what we call today the brain valuation system. But this is, I just wanted to share my story, how I started, right? So, and then, sorry, let me move to this. What is interesting is now that, so this was, so my dissertation was roughly published in 2005, right? And you see all of a sudden here, there was an interest in this idea of neuromarketing. And so, and maybe, I'm not sure how much you guys are on top of this literature. This was unfortunately actually not my dissertation that was published, but it was another paper that was published that all of a sudden got us all interested in this. So there were a lot of academic papers that followed, and there were a lot of Google searches on the topic of neuromarketing. So this is now for neuromarketing, which is a bit different from neuroeconomics, which I'll tell you in a sec about. And this was a famous Coke Pepsi study from Sam McClure that was published, right? This was interesting because, so if you actually look at it was published in the journal Neuron, which is a prestigious journal in cognitive neuroscience. And when you look actually on the author names, you see that one name appears twice, which is the name of the senior author, Reed Montagu, and there's also his daughter actually on it. And why is this? This is because his daughter had a school project in high school in the United States where they were excited about a certain phenomenon. In her case, this was the Coke and Pepsi challenge. So this means that I let you drink Coke and Pepsi in a blind test. You don't know which one it is. So you have like cups that don't have the name on it, and people, you know, they actually don't really have a preference. The moment I do a non-blinded testing, so I tell you this is Coke, this is Pepsi, there's a preference reversal, which is against the law of rational choice theory in economics, that all of a sudden everyone likes Coke and nobody likes Pepsi anymore, right? So they took this to as a cognitive neuroscience experiment to a brain imaging scanner. They delivered Coke and Pepsi inside that scanner. And this was kind of, in some ways, the birth of the field of neuromarketing. And there were lots of reactions. So there was lots of excitement about this, but also there was consumer protection agencies that got really concerned, like, oh my God, they're like the bad guys from economics and business and marketing folks, and they're the bad guys from the medical field, those that do brain imaging. They team up and they now want to understand what we do and control our thoughts and make us buy things that we don't want and influence us subliminally. I mean, you all know as scientists that this is not possible, right? So but the layperson obviously doesn't know this. We all have this idea of these tests where the subliminal advertising tests that were actually fake, right? I hope that all of you know this, right? So if you go, you sit in the movie theater and there's Coke and popcorn landed in. This was never done as a real experiment, and those that tried to replicate it failed to replicate it. But so that's obviously the layman's intuition is that this is bad. So now all of a sudden we can read people's thoughts and we can make them buy stuff that they don't want to buy. Which is also, again, a bit, I think, naive to think, because I would never get, for example, Mehdi to buy feminine hygiene products because he just does not need them because he's male, right? So, except he might buy them for his partner, I don't know, right? So, but you see what I'm getting at, right? So, and specifically because companies do want to sell things more than once. So, even if they might have told you to buy something once, it's very hard to do this several times, right? So this was the start of neuromarketing, and so here's a bit, this is taken from Thomas Ramday's book. You see a bit like, so there are three fields that are in some ways could have an overlap. There's economics, there's psychology, and there's neuroscience. And so you have, for example, traditional economics, you have behavioral economics, and then you have in between psychology and economics, you have marketing. And then there is now neuromarketing, and this is, I guess I have defined it at some point, is the idea of company-specific market research using tools from neuroscience. Then there's consumer neuroscience, which is more the academic efforts that is not company-specific research. It's more to better understand underlying brain mechanisms of consumer decision making. So this is something that I would say I do. And then there's also neuroeconomics, which is a bit more geared towards economics. So some other types of behavior, such as decision making and uncertainty and so forth. But consumer neuroscience and neuroeconomics, they have clearly an overlap. So I perceive myself as a neuroeconomist, as a neuroeconomist and as a consumer neuroscientist. And what is interesting now, this might be shocking to you, so this is sorry, why is this kind of moving forward without my wanting to move forward? This is now a survey from the National Institutes of Advertisers, because so advertising in neuromarketing is the killer application specifically to tweak ads, right? So what people do is instead of having a 60-minute ads that could cost up to, you know, $1 million to air during the Super Bowl, instead of having 1 minute, they try to trim it down to 30 seconds because this saves costs, because then, so the air cost is by time, right? So if you have a shorter one that you think works better, that is good for the company because they're saving money on this, right? So so that's why, so when you ask, so this is different companies that were asked that do or don't do neuroscience, and I'm very surprised by this 30% of people saying like neuroscience will replace traditional market research techniques. I don't think that it does, right? So I think it's almost a complement. You need to have specific questions that are good for using neuroscience tools. So I'm more in the middle of this graph, where saying like, look, it could be an interesting tool to add to. More specifically, so I think, you know, a lot of you here do attention. I think this is awesome. I think we need to use more eye tracking. It answers a very cool question, which is like, where are people looking at in my ad? Where are people looking at in my website? And you even can get rid of the eye tracker, right? There are today a couple of companies, and I mean, this is stemming from Research Division Neuroscience, for example, from Christoph Koch and ET, that developed algorithms based on all those brain scans to predict where people are looking at. It's not perfect, but it has a decent accuracy of in between 75 to 80%. And so this is, for example, one of those algorithms. This is a trading website. And what you see here, and I guess lots of you are familiar with this, so the hotter the area, the more likely that people will be looking at that. And this was not done on an eye tracking experiment. This was done running an algorithm on the feature of the website. And there are a couple of neuromarketing companies that offer this, right? So, and I think this is cool because this helps you to design a website where you can arrange stuff so that, you know, one can actually see things and it's not too cluttered. Right? So that's a clear value add of this. Then there is some effort also in reading facial emotions. And this is something also based on machine learning algorithms, that instead of putting electrodes in your face, you can now capture the video and then read people's faces, right? So this works only under very specific conditions. People can't really move. And so it's not very natural. I mean, it's obviously more natural than having those electrodes in your face. And for me, so I've tried this in research. It works good for like a measure globally of valence, but it's harder, I think, to detect specific emotions because it's just not as subtle or not as sensitive as putting in the electrodes that would actually capture the movement of the muscles. I'm not going to show you how this works because I guess you're all familiar with that. And then there are these thingies where, so this is the eye tracker that you could use in the field. And you see also here, there's something on the front. This is one of the more fancier EEG headsets from the company called Emotive. And what they do is, so they have people running around in the supermarket with those things, which, you know, I think, I'm not an EEG person, so some of this that I might say might be a bit ignorant, right? So, but it's, I think you can use EEG for some of the questions that companies have, right? So I'm very skeptical about having people run around in the supermarket with this because there's obviously lots of other stuff going on. It's very hard to, I mean, those of you that have done research in neuroscience, you know, it's very hard to find good ways to synchronize the neural signal with the stuff that people are seeing. And this is obviously important to make correlations. It's also that, so I remember I was invited to speak at the World Marketing Congress at some point, a World Neuromarketing Congress, and then they were all like, oh, there's this weird scientist, and she puts people in her eye machine. This is not ecologically valid, so this is not like in the real world, which is true, but at least it's controlled, right? So, and putting people with those headsets in the field. It's a lab in the field experiment. It's not a field experiment. So you might be risking to take the worst of those experimental approaches, meaning you don't know what you're measuring. It's very noisy. And it's also not that ecologically valid, because these people, they realize, oh, I have this headset on and I have those glasses in front of me. So field experiment means that you're not aware of the fact that you're part of the experiment. So I would be careful with those statements. So then one thing that I think is something that is exciting, which has not made its way into market research practice yet, is the idea of using neuroscience as a predictive tool to forecast future decisions. And so this is the seminal work from Brian Knudson's group and Alex Genevsky's group, who's a marketing professor at Erasmus in Rotterdam. So he asks questions like, so he uses data from Kickstarter, that's a crowdfunding website, so where people say, hey, this is my idea. And then they're asking for money from people like you and me. And so he looked at this data and he was interested in to see, can we actually forecast using the brain data from just a few people? So I think mostly it's something between 35 and 40 participants in his studies. Is there something that we can see in the brain that would predict whether products get funded or not? And indeed, what he finds is that activity of this, so this is out of sample prediction, right? So in the brain's valuation system, so here you see the ventral medial prefrontal cortex, here's the ventral striatum. This does predict whether a product gets funded or not at the market level. So to help you unpack this a little bit, this is what we usually do in medical studies with tools such as fMRI and EEG to try to predict, or we try to understand, correlate the behavior of 1% of a patient, for example. What those of you that are coming more from the social science perspective are doing is you have a bunch of participants, again, something between 30 and 40. You try to understand their underlying neural mechanisms of a certain mental process of your choice, right? So, but what is interesting about this idea of neural forecasting is that they try actually to predict taking brain activity from a different, so it's not individual level anymore, from a different set of people. They try to predict an outcome on the market level, really. And this is actually something that has been done quite a bit in academic research, most actually published in neuroscience journals. Started with, like, can we predict whether a song will be successful? So this is Greg Burns' work. Where they used Nielsen sound scan data and then predicted, also using brain valuation system activity using fMRI. They did predict which song became a hit or not. Then there is Emily Falk's work on can we actually predict whether people will call us quit smoking hotline using brain activity, and same here, but a bit more on a focus on the VMPFC. She found that yes, we can actually predict people's responses to this, what we call public service announcement, so ads from the government, right? And this seems to work. And then there is some work on from a German group on, together with Ferrero, can we actually predict how people respond to different types of pop-up ads on the point of sale? And same here, so it's a range valuation system that seems to be involved. Can we predict advertising elasticities, comparing different types of neuroscientific methods? So this is work that was spearheaded by Vinod Vikantaraman. He compared EEG, fMRI, biometrics such as skin conductance, and eye checking, and what else? Skin conductance, and I think also facial emotions, right? So, and the best predictor, I mean, the strongest predictor was actually just the brand dummy, but above and beyond that, then this was actually fMRI that helped most to predict sales of the advertised product, which is measured in this paper as advertising elasticity. And then, so this was Alex's work we already talked about. You also did this not only for crowd funding, also for microfinancing. So these appeals on like, give me money for my project, and what you see here. And then also how people respond and share stuff on social media. So, and this is something that is almost, I mean, so this sounds fascinating, right? And I'm always like wondering why companies are not doing this for market research if it works so well. So that's why also then I got, this is my one really marketing project that I have. I got really interested in that. I teamed up with a German retailer. We asked the question, you know, how much will this product actually sell? And can we then, what we did is we compared market data, so price, promotion level, with representative survey data, then with fMRI and incentivized purchase data from those participants. And we specified a structural model, trained the model on some part of the products that we had, and then tested it. And what we found is that, I mean, as you might have an educated guess, combining all of those data works the best, so it gives the best prediction. But I was actually amazed by how much fMRI can contribute. So I think it had 80, in the current version of the paper, it has 28% of additional explained variance over our baseline model. And this is a lot, right? So, and then if you think about how much money do you spend on this, because obviously, you know, doing an fMRI study is more expensive than doing some of the other stuff. The market data, for example, is available for free. It nevertheless seems to pay off, right? So if you're interested in that paper, it's under review right now. I'm happy to share this.
Sorry, we should leave the floor soon to Celia and Mariam to keep some time for discussion.
Sure. I have my last slide and then I'm done.
Perfect.
So all of this was now around what market research companies do in order to improve their predictions and help companies to forecast. Right? There's another part that I think is very exciting, is how you can think about as an entrepreneur to integrate neuroscience as part of your product. So for example, I'm on the advisory board on some of the companies that are doing this. And there's obviously some stuff that doesn't work, like this one here. So there are lots of products that say, look, we can use neuroscience to help you to train. And this is like a TCDS thingy that you see here, right? That you become more intelligent and you do these games. There was a big study also published in Neuron that showed, no, this doesn't work this way. Because obviously intelligence is something that's much more distributed in the brain. But then the other ideas on, like, maybe we can use neuroscience to help people to transition from different brain states using EEG, right? There's lots of apps and little startups out there. I don't think they have cracked it yet, but the idea, again, I'm not an EEG person, might be quite interesting. My two favorite companies that are using neuroscience for their business idea is this is Pymetrics. What they have done is they're using tasks that from cognitive neuroscience to make hiring more equal. So with these tests, that is in addition to normal interviews that you do, they're much less prone to gender bias, so they can reduce gender bias by quite a bit. I think that is interesting. And then there's also a company, Perceptive Automata. What they do is for self-driving cars, they're using signal detection theory to help us, and this is now the funny part, to have self-driving cars to be more human again, because in an urban environment, as compared to the middle of nowhere and the desert of Arizona, humans actually, they might be better as machines to make driving decisions, because we can tell from body language and unconscious signals or non-verbal signals whether people will cross the street or not, right? So, but the Perceptive Automata, they have a bit of a harder time selling their idea, but I like that idea. And with that, I thank you very much for your attention. Again, here I wanted to give you an overview on what companies are actually doing in this space, and a bit, read what I'm doing in this space. So.
Yeah, thank you very much, Wiebke. A very rich presentation with a lot of elements I've noted down and fruitful thoughts. And so, yeah, many things that we will hopefully discuss further. I just want to react on a few points. Completely agree with you, like saying basically just forbidding advertising would not be a very reasonable and efficient message. But then there are the questions of what can we do as scientists. So sometimes there are regulations on some particular ways of doing advertising. So, for example, subliminal image in advertising is forbidden in France since 1992. Sometimes there could be regulations on advertising for some products. So the even law in the 90s is also famous in France, like advertising for tobacco or some alcohol is forbidden. So there's the question nowadays, should there also be regulations for advertising for products that have high CO2 emission rates, which is a question, I guess, for citizens and so on. I thank you very much for reminding, and I forgot to do it in the introduction. There's also the question of how people understand health messages in advertising, and it's very important. And us as scientists, we can help improve maybe those messages and so on. So I hope that Marianne can talk much better about this. And I guess, and that's something I put briefly in my introduction, we can hopefully also help advertisers making better adverts and more ethical adverts, because I think a lot of advertisers love their job and would like to do something ethical and something better, beneficial for the society. And so probably we can also give them knowledge and so on and help them improve. Maybe one last point I wanted to mention about the fact you mentioned that kids watch less TV and so these days and are more watching YouTube. So the last figures of Médiamétrie, I've just read them from 2021, is still an average of 3 hours and 41 minutes per day per person. And you're right that it has decreased a bit, but for kids between 4 and 14 years old, but it's just decreased by 20 minutes. So as scientists, we know that more than 3 hours per day is still concerning. And I guess that's something we should think of. Yeah, so about those questions of now, what type of regulations, what can we do? What laws can we promote, and particularly about digital advertising? I would like to invite Celia Zolinsky, who is a professor of law at University Paris 1, Panthéon-Sorbonne. Celia, are you here?
Yes. Can you see me, hear me?
Yes. Yes, we can.
So thank you for inviting me to exchange with you this morning. Maybe I try to share my slide. Thank you. So, okay. Can you see the slide?
Yeah, absolutely. Perfect.
Okay, thank you. So to introduce this presentation about law behind advertisements, I would like to present you briefly the legal framework concerning this digital advertisements. And first, let's notice that, as Mehdi said, the notion of advertisement is very comprehensive. And this includes all communications tools like non-commercial ones, such as name domain, email addresses, and use of metadata. And the principle here is the freedom for professionals regarding their advertisement strategies. However, professionals must respect the principle of transparency and fairness in their practices. And for example, any kind of advertisement must be identified as an advertisement to guarantee that the public users is well informed about the nature of the information presented. And this legal framework applies to all media, including websites and social networks. And the goal here is to guarantee both consumers' rights and free competition. So regarding digital advertising, a special legal framework is imposed for, as you know, the use of cookies. All these trackers can be used, for example, to measure the site's audience, to address advertisement, or to interact with social networks. When they are not strictly necessary for the operation of the site visited, e-privacy directive imposes that these cookies may only be used for with the consent of the user. And the end user has also to be informed previously in case of deposit of cookies and he or she could refuse it. Furthermore, the GDPR has straightened the requirements for the validity of this consent. For example, now the mere continuation of navigation on a website can no longer be regarded as a valid expression of consent to the use of those kind of cookies. So the consent must now be the result of an, as we said, an ambiguous positive act on the part of the user. In September 2020, the French National Regulatory Authority regarding personal data, the French CNIL, has published new guidelines to explain these obligations and has presented good practices on cookie use. The goal here is to reinforce internet users in order to enable them, us, to maintain control over our personal data against cookies and tracking devices. So as you see in the slide, the main principles concerning are concerning real and free consent. So individuals should be able to give a real consent, must be able to decline to give consent as easily as to give consent, and to withdraw their consent as easily as they gave it. And individuals must also be informed of the objective of the collect and its consequences before giving his or her their consent, and of the identity of the controllers deposit cookies. And after, the CNIL has given operators 6 months to comply with these new rules. Last December, following investigation, the CNIL has noted that, for example, the websites facebook.com, google.fr, and youtube.com offer a button allowing the user to immediately accept cookies. However, they do not provide an equivalent solution enabling the users to easily refuse the deposit of their cookies. And here several clicks are required to refuse all cookies against a single one to accept them. So the CNIL considers that this process affects the freedom of consent. So the fact that they cannot refuse, the users cannot refuse the cookies as easily as they can accept them influences their choice in favor of consent. And for the CNIL, this constitutes an infringement of the French Data Protection Act, transposing this e-privacy directive. And as a result, the CNIL issued a fine of 150 million euros against Google and 60 million euros against Facebook. This example is, sorry, I would like to share the other slide. So I have a problem with the slide. So sorry for this. Next one. Yeah, it's okay.
Yeah, perfect.
So this example leads to a more general questioning about so-called dark patterns, as Mehdi mentioned, that could alter consumers' freedom of choice, even manipulate their decisions. So this tries to address this exploitation of cognitive bias and limited rationality of end users through the implementation of biased choice architectures, so-called dark patterns, for reducing our choices or manipulate consent. And this raises the question of the legality of what we call bad nudge. I mean, incentive to make choices that do not conform to the interest of the user, and also of sludge, in other words, using design to prevent users from making any preferable choices. Those new practices make the issue even more important, especially using AI algorithms to identify more precisely micro-segmented or each user's vulnerability, and not no more only biases generally present in the population, using profiling methods, algorithmic proposal, and users' interfaces. So this hyper-nudging, micro-targeted, could then exploit users' cognitive and emotional weaknesses to orient their decision in a direction that doesn't correspond, finally, to their initial or reasonable preferences. Then we try now to think about the tools to address those risks. And first, such practices could be sanctioned. In case of data processing, we could consider as shown a breach of the GDPR obligations or principle concerning, for example, free and clear consent, transparency, and privacy by design. And I recommend you the document of the French CNIL, La forme des choix, on this topic. More generally, we could also argue that this could be considered such as what we call unfair commercial practice, and this is prohibited by the EU law, especially with a directive on unfair commercial practices. One currently argues that such practices have to be now prohibited, and we have some reforms adopted in the US regarding dark patterns, for example, in California, in the state of California, with the new Consumer Privacy Act regulation. And at the federal level, we have also a bill to prohibit it as a certain kind of dark patterns. And in France, we had a proposition, a bill, but which hasn't been adopted, to prohibit, to propose, that bill has proposed to prohibit dark patterns if this could manipulate consumer choice. But it hasn't been adopted. Now, we are currently discussing in the EU level a new regulation, so-called Digital Services Act. And the European Parliament proposed in this special regulation to prohibit a certain kind of dark patterns. So as you can read in the slide, the European Parliament, in a version of the text adopted a few days ago, last January, the EU Parliament proposes to specify that providers of intermediary services shall not use the structure, function, or manner of operation of their online interface to distort or impair recipients of services' ability to make a free, autonomous, and informed decision or choice. But considering that the potential impact of emotional data processing, sorry, I have some problem with my slides. Sorry, I will try to show you the last one. So this is, okay. Can you see?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes, okay. So considering the potential impact of emotional data processing, especially for advertisement, some also argue that this legal framework could not be sufficient. And to address this point, using emotional data and AI algorithmic system, we could then require operators to perform a new risk analysis to evaluate and report those risks, following a new logic of accountability now promoted by the EU in the field of digital services and tools, as we can see with this Digital Services Act and also the AI Act. We could also impose new obligation of information about business models and algorithmic practices to empower end users and also public regulators in this special field. The risks related to the processing of emotions could also lead to the consideration of supervision of such processing, perhaps even to their prohibition when this, what I can call emotional processing, represents a high risk for the rights and freedom of individuals. And to go further, one now also promotes the consecration of new rights for individuals, for example, to protect psychological integrity and even to protect our attention. So I can tell you more about this proposal after if you want. All those points are currently under discussion. And I think that an interdisciplinary analysis is very important to go further. So I would like to discuss with you on this topic and to debate about what we can do now. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Celia. Also many elements, and from the juridical, I guess, law aspects that I'm very unknowledgeable. And one thing I would like to make sure I understood correctly, because it seems striking. I think at some point you said that the mere continuation of navigation by users is considered maybe no longer sufficient as a sufficient sign of their consent. Did I understand correctly? I mean, is this something on which there exists some regulation?
Yes, the guidelines of the CNIL precise that the mere continuation of navigation is no more an expression of your free consent. You have to have a special action, a clear positive act, such as I mentioned in the slide, clicking on the one. I accept this cookie banner you have when you are going on a website. And we are currently discussing about how to design this cookie banner when you have to accept to have a real cognitive efficient action, not only this click habit we all have just to access the website. Yeah. So it's one of our main challenge now to address the cognitive efficiency of legal obligation and then design. And this could be also the challenge with this emotional driving economy that we know that emotion could be considered as such as a sensitive data in a special context. But we know that in the GDPR legal framework, processing of sensitive data is prohibited, but says exemption, for example, with the consent of what we call the individual concerned by the processing of his or her data, and we all give our consent. We could all give our consent. So so that's why we are currently proposing to, in the special context, consider this emotional data processing as a sensitive one. So this could be in certain contexts prohibited. especially when I mentioned this particularly provoke a high risk for our fundamental freedom and, for example, psychological integrity.
Yeah, thank you very much. And that's a very important question, the question of are we allowed to process emotional data from users and for which users and so on. And I hope we can pursue the discussion about this afterwards. So thank you again very much, Celia. And now we'll hear about our last speaker of this roundtable, Mariam Chama from Direction interministérielle de la transformation publique. Mariam, hello.
Yeah. Hello.
Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you for inviting me. So believe it or not, my computer crashed this morning, so I had 20 minutes to concoct some new slides, and thankfully I could borrow the slides of one of our interns who used this to present his master's thesis. So sorry, it's going to be a micmac of Frankenstein slides with many different things that I just improvised right now. As Mehdi and Camille were saying earlier, I work at a directorate called Direction interministérielle de la transformation publique, which is under the authority of the Ministry of Public Transformation. And I mean, to summarize a little bit, our team, which is a very small team of 5 permanent members and of course interns, the work we do is basically trying to translate behavioral insights and behavioral science knowledge and incorporate that into public policies. And we do that in partnership with experts, either researchers that work on various topics or people who have specific expertise in behavioral insights, such as the Behavioral Insights team or Agence d'Innovation Comportementale. Just very broadly, to give you an idea, I'm not specifically an expert on neither advertisement nor neuromarketing, but one of our topics was specifically on consumer protection and specifically from dark patterns, which were mentioned several times earlier. But we also work on very various topics. So for example, how to convince doctors to prescribe less antibiotics when it's not necessary, or for example, how to convince people to do more covoiturage. I forgot the word in English. And so it's very, we work on very different topics. Some of them are quite linked. So for example, if you look at education on the right hand side, we've worked on things like how to reduce screen exposure in children, or for example, how to increase sleep also in young children. So very quickly again, and I won't go into each of these subsets, but our work is basically trying to, first of all, bring scientific knowledge and behavioral insights, but also the scientific method. So trying to do lit reviews and also trying to find solutions that are implementable for policymakers, and then evaluate them using real life experimentation. So ideally something we call randomized controlled trials. So that's how you test for medication, having control groups and test groups. And I think that in this specific audience, you're all very familiar with these methods. And so our idea is to test before making recommendations to policymakers, trying to test our implementations that are inspired from behavioral science. And once we actually see that it works, then we recommend scaling of that solution. And now we go, I think, to the slides of Ghali, who, so there's a change in template. And so basically, what I wanted to share with you today is an experiment that we did with the DGCCRF, which is an acronym for the General Directorate for Competition and basically Consumer Affairs and Fraud Control. So this is a directorate that sits under the Ministry of Economics, and they have two hats. One of them is kind of like working on competition and basically what products make it to the market, but they also have another role, which is controlling fraud. So for example, products that are put on the market that don't, let's say on an online website, that don't correspond to the reality of the product, or for example, any type of signalement. So a consumer sees something that's not in, I mean, that doesn't follow or that violates certain rules, they can signal that on a website called Signal Conso. So anyway, so DGCCRF came to see our team. I mean, approached us around 2 years ago, and they wanted to see if we could help them basically implement behaviorally informed solutions to address the problem, which was that there's a growing number of consumers that are reporting instances of online fraud. And what's interesting is that in these in these reports from consumers, there's a mix of different things. So there's either things where you buy a product, but you never receive it. So you buy it online and it never arrives. Or there are things like you buy a product, but it doesn't at all match descriptions of what the product was, what it was online. But there's also other things such as some consumers were feeling pressured into buying things under some urgency, or things that were on the screen, which kind of made them buy the thing without them really knowing what they were committing to. So the reasons for these signalings or frauds were very various, and some of them are completely illegal practices, but some of them are not illegal. It's just that they put a lot of pressure on the consumer, but they're not illegal per se. And I would say that many of those fall in the dark pattern title. So what is a dark pattern? Basically, you've all seen dark patterns. If you've bought anything online, you've probably been confronted with dark patterns. So for example, if you're buying an online ticket, you see something saying there's only five places left, you need to buy it in the next 10 minutes or it will disappear. Or for example, there's also other types of dark patterns which are shaming. So for example, the company asks your consent for something, and if you say no, they say, okay, fine, don't help us and don't help humanity. And I remember Facebook did something like this where they were asking consent for facial recognition, and if you said that you didn't want to accept the facial recognition, they said, okay, then you're not helping a lot of visually impaired people who would have really benefited from this. So there's kind of different types of dark patterns, and I won't go into all of them, but basically you have the ones that put urgency pressure. So there's a countdown and the clock is ticking while you're on the website and the offer is going to end. Or there are things where they use scarcity. So for example, there's only one left, as I was saying earlier. Or for example, some of them which are illegal is sneaking into your basket a product which you hadn't clicked on. And so there's a big variety and heterogeneity of situations. And so to come back to DGCCRF, basically what they wanted us to, the help they wanted us to bring to them was how to inform consumers better about these dark patterns. And initially, they told us that on the website of DGCCRF, they have forms that are called fiches conso. So it's like forms where or reports that help consumers acquire the tools and get more information about what is a dark pattern, how do you protect yourself, etc. Except that when we were approached on this question of how to make these fiches conso more clear and more interesting for consumers, we thought it might not be that. We thought there could be a way to make this information more relevant and bring it to the consumer at a more interesting time than on the website of the DGCCRF. Because, do you see yourself going on a website of a public, DGCCRF and trying to see how to protect yourself online? We thought that wasn't really an interesting user journey, and maybe we should bring this information at a time where consumers are much more alert, much more open to the information, and they will take this information into account into their future online shopping. So after doing a first round of interviews with consumers that had already signaled frauds online, but also experts from the DGCCRF, and after looking at a lot of the scientific literature on these topics, and there's a lot of, the research on this topic is right now growing, and there's a lot of things in there. But basically, we kind of found that there are three different factors that explain the vulnerability of consumers online. The fact that people have maybe limited attention, specifically when they are shopping online. So you are in this idea that you want to buy a product, and you're just like, your goal is very specific, and you're not paying attention to all the things that are put on the website and are displayed. There's also emotional factors. So for example, there are good deals, or for example, messages telling you, reviews from other consumers telling you the product is amazing, and so you're being kind of in a moment that is very emotional, and you just want to buy and get your product. And there's also a very big asymmetry between what the online platform is using and the way they are kind of exploiting your biases.
Oui.
Is someone trying to ask a question or to talk?
No, it's fine. I enabled the microphone.
No. And so, yeah, there's an asymmetry of information between what the website is doing and knows about you and yourself. So based on these three big, categories of techniques that were used, we thought maybe we can use these, and you're going to be, I think, surprised by the intervention that we did. Maybe we can use these to actually simulate and create a website that kind of uses everything that marketing uses, or neuromarketer. And for that, I'm going to actually show you the website, because it's going to be even nicer. So there you go. I'm going to share again up. Can you see my
yes.
Can you see the website? Okay, cool. So what we did is we created a website. We created a fake product called Di Bartolo, which is a coffee machine that goes from 300 euros to 59 euros for only a limited period of time. It has great ratings, as you can see, and we kind of simulated these various dark patterns that we saw to be quite effective. The fact that there's scarcity, there's only 8% left, many people have reserved and got it delivered. We even had a lot of fun describing the machine and creating all these fake consumer reviews, which is a fantastic machine, amazing, super coffee, blah, blah, blah. And so you can't see the timer here, but when you're on the website, the timer, when the website was active, the timer was actually running. So you were like, oh my God, I just need to buy this machine right now. And so we also discovered that we had talent for neuromarketing. So in case we want to change jobs one day, it could work. And interestingly, this conditions générales de vente, so the terms and agreements to this coffee machine, if you clicked on it, it had everything. It said that this is an experiment, this coffee machine does not exist, we're doing this to test vulnerability of consumers, except that very, very little people clicked on the conditions générales de vente. I think, if I remember correctly, it was maybe 6 people from a sample of 6,000 who actually clicked on the ad, which is quite scary. But anyway, that's besides the point. So let me go back to showing you the way we did this experiment. Oops, I'm opening the wrong slide. Sorry, just one second. Can you still see my slides?
Nope.
No.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Okay. Up and there you go. Now you can see them, I hope.
Yep.
Okay, so what we did is we created this website, and then we posted this ad, this fake coffee machine website on Facebook. And what we were hoping to do is create 3 groups, one control group, which places the order. And when I say places the order, it means they enter their email and their home address, but they don't put their coordonnées bancaires, they don't buy the machine. And we tell them that they can pay on arrival. So once the machine is delivered, they can pay the coffee machine. The second group was a group which, once they entered their names and wanted to order the machine, they received a pop-up, as you can see en haut à gauche. It said, beware, you've clicked on a false offer that the DGCCRF is testing. And this is basically to get the public to be more aware about, pour faire de la sensibilisation and get people aware of the techniques that could be used, from like using dark patterns to trick you. And in this condition, we had 5, as you can see, en haut à gauche, à droite du site web, there's 5 heuristics, so 5 rules of thumb that you can use to protect yourself. For example, making sure that there is HTTPS secure in the bar of search, or you can type the name of the website on another website to see if other people have reported it being fake, or trying to see if there is the legal conditions, and also seeing if the website has a contact or an address or if it's fake. So 5 rules of thumb. And then the third group of people, our second treatment group, was basically getting people to, on top of having these 5 rules of thumb, directly be directed to an online quiz and a small formation where we train them on different websites to detect dark patterns. So what we do is we show them different screenshots of websites, and they have to click on where they see some dark patterns, and then we tell them if they were correct in detecting all the patterns or not. So it's like kind of a short training, let's say like a critical thinking training. And so what we wanted to do after these 3, once we have these 3 groups, what we wanted to do is now retarget all these people, because now we have their identity and their emails, and target them with a new ad and see whether which of these groups are the most vulnerable to re-victimization. So do the people who get the 5 tips on how to protect themselves online versus the ones who do the small training versus the ones who get nothing, is there a difference in how much they're going to be re-victimized or not? The result slides aren't on this deck of slides because it was before we got the results. We got the results. There's no significant difference between the 3 groups, but what we see is that there's a trend, which means that if we had left our advertisement longer on Facebook, because also I won't go into the details, but at some point Facebook brought down our ads, so we had to put them back on, and so there was this issue of not having enough time and enough sample in our group, even though in total we had 2,500-ish participants in our experiment. So the results show that the 5 tips plus the formation together decrease vulnerability of consumers by around 45%, but it's not significant, it's just a trend. So I think if we want to have more significant results, we need to test it for longer. So this is just to show you one type of thing which can be done, and trying to test whether critical thinking or getting consumers more aware of these dark patterns is one way to go about. Now, once this experiment was done with DGCCRF, and we finished recently, so basically in around November, the discussions we're having with this directorate right now is what can we do to go further and get this information on dark patterns, not only in the hand of consumers, because that's one way of fighting this issue, but also in the hands of regulators. So for example, the teams in DGCCRF which do these the lawsuits against companies. So Celia was mentioning these different lawsuits, for example, towards Google or Amazon or any other. For example, recently I think there was a huge lawsuit against Grindr, which is the dating website, because of data sharing. And so the idea is for us is to how to bring this knowledge on behavioral insights, on cognitive biases and exploitation of biases to the hands of those people who are doing these lawsuits. And so we've started, we already did this once by looking at what the lawsuit looks like and trying to bring scientific evidence to back up the arguments that are being used by regulators. That's one way to go about. Another way to go about is to bring this information to the hands of, at the table in the discussions in the European Commission and all the laws that are being right now thought about to implement and maybe ban certain types of dark patterns. So Celia mentioned a little bit of this, but I know that pre-ticking boxes, for example, les choix par défaut, where you have a pre-ticked box for an insurance that you automatically get. For example, there was a law that came out in 2013, which banned this type of practice. The problem is that many companies are ready to pay the penalty and to still, go on with their dark pattern practice. But there's a lot of, I mean, this topic is being brought to the attention of regulators, and I mean, we're hoping to create with DGCCRF a team of behavioral scientists that are going to help them, I mean, kind of enforce more and more laws in this domain. Camille, can you give me a signal if I crossed my time? I think I'm almost done with the main things that I wanted to tell you, but
yeah, the point is to keep a little bit of time for discussion. So like, well, yeah, whenever.
Okay. So I'm just gonna do concluding remarks, but basically the whole question is that I mean, today we're on a very slippery slope, and it's becoming more and more difficult. So, for example, imagine you're on a bus, you're going back to your house from your work, you're extremely tired, you're extremely hungry, and I mean, companies know that you are on your phone. With the location tracking, they know that you're extremely vulnerable, and they can send you those ads at that specific time because they know that you're more likely to buy them at that specific time. And so even though each thing on its own might seem
acceptable,
maybe isolatedly it might not seem harmful, but taken together, the amount of data that companies have on us, the amount of knowledge that's being used by people who have expertise in behavioral insights to inform marketing practices is becoming super asymmetric. And even though critical thinking and teaching people and giving them back the tools to fight these are very important, it's still you're still giving them small des petites cure-dents to fight an army of I mean a nuclear army that is against us. So I think it's very important that I mean, regulation steps in, and also it was mentioned before, but designers, design by ethics, integrating ethics teams into each design company so that designers, and we already tried this. We already tried courses on attention for designers, but it still has its limits. But I think that, I mean, for me, and this maybe can open the floor for discussion. There is hope in fighting this battle, but I think companies should be hit where it bleeds, meaning financially. The penalties that should be done should cost a lot, and there should be really very strong regulations, because otherwise the asymmetry is going to be too huge to fight. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Mariam. So just a little timing checkpoint. We're now at 11:30, and we planned now a 15-minute break. The next roundtable is starting at 11:45. However, like, I'm really into the discussion. So those who want to take a break, like, we're going to be happy to see you back in 15 minutes. But now we can still have time for discussion between well, Mehdi, Mariam, Celia, and Hilke.
Yeah, I think that Mariam just brought up a very important point, which is the importance of cross-disciplinary education, right? So, and we have this partnership with Assas, so with the legal studies of Sorbonne, where I teach them a bit about marketing, and I teach them also about customer privacy from the business perspective. But they're saying, like, look, it's hard because we're not trained in social media practices. So we know a little bit, but not enough, right? So how can I learn more? And I think this needs to be built much more into the curriculum for legal studies also, right? Because it's hard to write like new GDPR rules that are based on an assumption of the consumer that we will read through all the stuff. And Mariam just showed very impressively that we don't read through all these things, right? So because we're not motivated enough. And which doesn't really fit our psychological viewpoint on what consumers do. The same is true for business students. So at INSEAD, we think of INSEAD as, we try to define business as a force for good, so which is very close to the heart of our leadership, of our dean. We have several centers for that promote diversity, sustainability, and whatnot, but also the topic of ethics. So we are about to introduce a new ethic core course. We always had some ethics, but it wasn't enough. So that reflects how we can be more ethical as in business from all of the different perspectives, from logistics, from marketing, from finance, and so forth. And I think that's important, right? So to educate. try to influence in that way positively our students also, that they think about this more, right? So I do see a shift in our students, right? When I started at INSEAD 2008, we had lots of finance guys that were more about profitability goals and not so much about societal goals. But since then, we've put in so much effort into saying, look, performance of companies, they don't have to be against performance, societal progress, right? So now you see, I mean, in some ways, you're shifting how the shareholder value evaluation from only financial goals to also to have ethical goals part of the function, of the goal function for those companies. And if they don't act on gender diversity, if they don't act on sustainability, then they will have a bad valuation. And I think that these are the things that we can do from the business side to accomplish this too. And education and science plays an important role there.
Yeah, thank you very much. I completely agree. And I find it really reassuring what you're saying, that the students themselves have evolved. And I'm wondering, actually, I think that would be fascinating to even measure this and publish this evolution, if you can measure. And I'm wondering to which extent, because showing to the other students might be a sort of nudge and pushing them to be also more ethical and so on. But I mean, that could be useful. Would it be a nice thing to do?
Yeah, great idea.
Maybe if I can add something, what is really important is education for sure, but also to have the educational tools. That means that we need some tool to make more comprehensive all those practices, and to to help, as you said, enforce critical thinking. So the presentation we have from Mariam was very important, and I put in the discussion in the chat a reference to the CookieViz tool developed by the CNIL and a collective of ethical designer. CookieViz, and also I put after in the chat a reference of the new tool of the CNIL called Data and Design Platform. That means some tool to put into discussion how to design interfaces and to show consumers and designer the way to understand all those practices, because it's good to be educated, but we have to clearly show what we can do with all these those tools. And maybe we could promote what the association called FING for l'association pour un Internet nouvelle génération. They promote with the CNIL a concept of, I don't know in English, but in French it's jouabilité, how to play with AI algorithm. That means to create fake profiles and to understand after the processing of data and the AI algorithmic treatments, what is the results, and to show what is the functioning without opening the black box, and to make clear how this is not make clear, but to more understand the functioning of this AI algorithm. So we have to think together how to promote those kind of tools to make us more capable to think about what we use. So all these initiatives are very important, I guess, I think, and we have to contribute to reinforce this critical thinking of consumers, but also public authorities.
Yeah. I think a lot of people around this table are really in favor of critical thinking and doing a lot of things. So we're on the same page. Camille, are there other questions?
Well, there are some questions, but I think you can go. The point, I guess, is more to promote discussion between our guest speakers. So in case there are some specific questions to each of you, I'm going to send them afterwards if you have some time to answer, and I'm going to give it back to people asking those questions. But Mehdi, I think we have a...
Yeah, it's true. I also have questions, but I would keep them for later. But so the speakers, I mean, if you wanted to ask questions to each other, I think that's a great time to do it, because this type of discussion between you is really informative for us. Otherwise, there was, because I see.
Otherwise, we have a list of questions.
For me, that was the question of also to which extent can we measure emotion, collect data about it, for which purpose? Are there good uses of emotion that can help? And I was even wondering, the experiment you did, Mariam, with GGCRF, and I find it fascinating, I love it, but to which extent is it acceptable to use deception in that case with the users? It's also an important question. I don't know if that's worth discussing here.
Yeah, if you want, I can jump on that question, and then we can. So it's very interesting, because when we first worked on this experiment, so the way we work is basically after we do the diagnosis, we suggest a variety of solutions, and then we try to see which one is either the most feasible and the most impactful, but also which one the administration is most interested in. And so when the list of solutions we had imagined for this problem was, for example, to have a plugin that helps detect dark patterns. So a plugin that you have on your website, and it tells you, watch out, this might be like we've detected 3 or 4 dark patterns. So we had less intrusive kind of solutions. And so in terms of the most risky solution, because we also classify them when we suggest, like, let's say five solutions or 10, we say, okay, so this one is a bit more risky, it has more ethical questions, etc. And in terms of riskiness, this one was the highest, because of course you're deceiving people, even though you're not actually getting money out of it. And by the way, one day we had so many clicks of people buying the machine, and we calculated that if we had gotten the money for it, it would be 150,000 euros of people actually buying a fake machine. But anyway, to go back to the point, so this one was the highest in terms of ethics and risks. So we completed a template. So Stéphane posted the report on the chat, and then if you click on it, there's a part on ethics and all the ethical precautions we took on this experiment, and you have the form on all the ethical questions we asked, and that included different things. It included, first of all, putting the information on the experiment in the conditions générales de vente. Second of all, sending a questionnaire after the experiment. So it would have been better before, but it would have ruined our design. Sending a questionnaire to all the people who were in the experiment to ask them on the acceptability of this experiment. So do they think this was acceptable? Do they think it was beneficial? Do they feel like it was their dignity was harmed because of being deceived and taken for fools, or you know what I mean? And so almost all the respondents, except I think 3 people, if I remember correctly, said that it was completely acceptable and that they learned from this, and that they were going to use, like, it's kind of, to use a word which is not exact, but it vaccinated them against future occurrences of fraud. And the people who said that it wasn't were just basically trying to understand what were the ethical measures we took. It's not that they were against it or found it to be unacceptable, but they wanted to follow up to know what were the measures. We also, at the end of the experiment, so once the 3 groups were, once the experiment was done, all the group participants received all the information about the process, why we did this, like the motivation behind it, and everyone received all the treatments that everyone got to kind of be equal in terms of treatment of the different groups. And they also had the number of like a hotline for victims in case they felt victimized, so that they could call and report the experiment. So we kind of found different ways. I don't know if that last point was clear, because I don't see you guys nodding, but basically there's a thing called France Victime, where if you found yourself to be a victim of something, you can call and report the instance that victimized you. So we gave them that possibility. Thankfully, no one called that hotline, but basically we tried to take all the measures we could in terms of ethics. But you're right. The question you're asking is right. And even I'm going to go even further. Throughout this experiment, I actually started wondering, like, what's the difference between dark patterns and nudges, which are for good? I mean, of course, you can say, okay, so when you're doing behavioral nudges to get people to, I don't know, eat more healthy food, or prescribe less antibiotic for when it's for doctors, or I don't know, even adopt any type of behavior. It's true that the intention is very different, and the intention is to make people, do things that are better for themselves, but that they're also completely in a policy framework where the policy in any case is very clear. But there's still, for me, there still remains a question of you're using some tools which sometimes in nudges are exploiting cognitive biases, and to what extent is that acceptable? It's a discussion that I've been, Mehdi, you know that we've been talking about ethics for a while, but it's still a discussion that I go back and forth with, and I struggle to find the limit. So for example, attention, exploiting people's attention to get them interested in a topic, you can say that is acceptable, because that's what we all use. If I want you to listen to me, I'm going to do things to exploit your attention. But if I exploit another bias, for example, I don't know, social norms, if I exploit the fact that I get many people to cheer for me, like Stefan in the chat, and for you guys to think I'm really, I don't know, I'm more interesting than I seem, that's another type of exploitation. So it's really, this question is tricky. The question of when you have a certain knowledge and there is an asymmetry of what I can use to exploit your biases, how do you draw the line? And it's, I'm not
There's an academic definition to that, right? So which is, as long as the people would agree that they don't want to engage in this behavior, right? At least at the Sunstein-Thaler definition, right? So, but it's obviously, that means there needs to be some norm, and for some things there will be a norm and will always be a fine line. And so there's a colleague of mine, Pierre Chandon, who has done a meta-analysis on what nudges for promoting healthy behaviors actually work. He categorized them in 3 categories: those that are informative, those that are affective/emotional, so saying like carrots have superpowers for children, and those that just change the order, for example, of things in the cafeteria to have the salad before the dessert and whatnot. And obviously the latter ones are the most effective ones, right? They have the highest effect size, the combustie, they work the best because you're changing the context, right? And it's clear that informational ones, they rely on so many other things in the customer journey that need to happen afterwards, and that might not happen, right? So, but then he also asked a question, he did an additional survey, like, so what do consumers actually want? Of course, they want the informational ones, because they think of themselves as the rational human being, as rational choice theory from economics would suggest, that they will look for all the information and they will make an informed decision, but they don't do this, right? So and that's a crux, right? So and there's not, I think it's a difficult question, right? At the end of the day, if you really want to put a provocative thought on this, is so all of the social media and this us trying to influence people, this is against democracy, right? So and I don't have a good answer for this question, right? So, but it seems to be that it's also affecting it. It's not fair, those things, right? Because people that are more educated will most likely be less prone to that than people that are less educated, right? So there are all sorts of difficult questions that I think your job is to answer them, not mine, but or like at least you're more involved than I am. So.
Yes,
I think,
yeah,
but your experiment, I think, so what you're saying is like, of course we're deceiving participants in this, but to get at some fundamental question, we need to deceive participants, otherwise you can't get at those questions, right? So if you would say, oh, we can't do this research, would be difficult, but I think you did the right thing. You debriefed them, and that's what you can do, right? So that's a problem with all the field experiments that are the gold standard in behavioral science, where people per se don't know that they're part of the experiment, and then you inform them later. But it's, I mean, from a university perspective, it's a difficult question. What are we doing? So we have this ethical board reviews, right? What are we doing with this? Because we obviously can't ask participants to consent into this, right? So that's also another big question, I guess, to throw out there.
Thank you so much for this discussion. I was about to say, I'm sorry that I have to cut this discussion, but actually I'm really happy about this beginning of discussion between you all, and I hope we can pursue them in the future. I don't know, we can have like next seminar or whatever.
Yeah.
I hope we will. So
Maybe,
thank you so much again. Sorry, Mehdi.
Along your lines, and as a sort of concluding sentence, I would like to repeat what Hilke has already said. We really need those type of discussions between different disciplines, even to improve our understanding of all these phenomena, and then transform it into more benefit for the society. So thank you very much for the organizers.
We definitely agree on that point. We definitely agree on that point. Thank you so much for our guest speakers for this first wonderful roundtable. Well, at least I found it wonderful. Thank you for teaching me those things. And now I'll leave the floor to Annelise and Pline for the second roundtable. I'll post on the discussion a few last questions for our guest speaker from the first one. If you have time to, well, send some resources, for example, or answer, that would be a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for having us. That was very interesting.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So good morning, everyone. We are coming to the last part of our morning Rethinking Science in Our Society. We now invite you to a time of reflection on the link between science, scientists, and public and political institutions. For this purpose, we welcome two guests who reflect on this issue on their works. First of all, Mathilde Mus, PhD student at the Department of Cognitive Studies at the ENS, Paris PSL University, as a member of the Jean-Nicot Institute. The focus of her PhD is to understand more in depth citizens' preferences towards environmental public policies. In particular, she studies cognitive and evolutionary mechanisms underlying social acceptability of green policies, such as carbon taxation, cap and trade systems, and regulation standards. Our second guest is Agnès Thiré, communication manager and board member of the French Reference Center for Animal Welfare, FRCO, in French, Centre National de Référence pour le Bien-être Animal, CNRBEA. Her career path has enabled her to acquire an extensive international experiences with pioneering world-leading organizations, working in strategy, governance, communications, and international relations. She is also trained in animal behavior science at the National Veterinary School of Alfort. Finally, this roundtable will be moderated by Pline, PhD student in educational sciences on the role of institutions and researchers on teachers' use and production of research and myself, Anaïs Dauphiné-Moret, PhD student in ethology on investigating animal intention to bring new lens on welfare, which is a criticism of theoretical framework of ethology. I will now give the floor to Agnès and Mathilde for further presentations, if they wish. So Mathilde, Agnès, do you want complete that I say for your presentation, or it's okay for you?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Thank you for having me. Can you hear me well and see me well? Yeah. All good? Great. So yeah, maybe just to add a few things. As a communications manager at the French Reference Center for Animal Welfare, the role here is to disseminate and communicate scientific, technical, regulatory knowledge and information about animal welfare to professionals, institutions, to policymakers as well, to authorities. And also my role as a board member is to contribute to setting guidelines for governance, for decision-making, for positioning of the organization and in its relations to institutions, to authorities, policymakers, and to partners. And I will be speaking on my own behalf today so that I can mobilize also work experience, previous work experience that maybe might be useful also for the roundtable today. And yeah, just again, thank you for to the organizers for the great workshop today, to the Learning Planet Institute. And it was great to hear about all the previous topics, the mini cells versus MGOs, the dark patterns, the staggering numbers of exposure to advertising and everything, and all the ethical matters that I think are of particular interests here, and that will be also of particular interest in our roundtable, I think. So thank you again.
Thank you a lot, Agnès. Mathilde, do you want to add something?
Yes, thank you so much for having both of us today. I'm really happy to be intervening in this roundtable. I had prepared a few slides just to describe what I do. Should I share them, or do you have them in your PowerPoint? I can share them if it's easier.
Yeah, I think you can.
Yes, okay. Can you see well and hear me well?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay, perfect. So it's just to complement what has been said. So my name is Mathilde Bellengier, and I'm a PhD student at the Department of Cognitive Studies at the ENS in Paris. So just to give you a quick overview of my background, I was first trained in economics for my bachelor degree, and then I was trained in cognitive science for my master's. And so for my PhD, I decided to join these two disciplines and to work with a cognitive science framework on an economic topic. And so for my PhD, I'm supervised by two senior researchers who are both interested in the interface between cognitive science and societal issues, who are Coralie Chevalier and Hugo Mercier. And to give you just a more precise idea of what I work on, as Agnès said, sorry, I work on trying to identify the cognitive and behavioral determinants that play a role in citizens' preferences towards environmental policies, and especially environmental public policies. So this can be regulation, carbon taxation, emission quotas systems, but what I'm really studying in all this is social acceptability. So what makes citizens prefer some green measures to other, or even within the same policy, why do people prefer some types of designs to others? And of course, there are so many ways to study social acceptability. There are sociological factors, there are economic factors, but as I was trained in cognitive science, I'm really focusing on the behavioral determinants of social acceptability. So to give you an idea, for example, I'm interested in fairness perceptions of green measures, also trust judgments, trust towards the government, trust towards other citizens. I'm also studying more general cognitive biases, such as mental accounting, maybe later loss aversion. So my PhD topic really lies at the intersection of several disciplines, the first of which is cognitive science, because that's my theoretical framework, but also environmental economics, because I study climate policy instruments, and of course, political science, because I'm interested in public support and attitudes. And I just wanted to finish with how I got to interact a little bit with institutions for now. So it's in chronological order. So during my studies a few years ago, I did an internship with Mariam and Stefan that you have had the pleasure of hearing at the DITT. So that was my first encounter with the French administration, really being outside academia and inside an administration. And then turning to more media institutions, with two friends of mine who are also doing a PhD, we created a LinkedIn group, which is called Cognitive Science and the Environment, Experts and Journalists. And the aim of this group is really to enhance experts' visibility in this domain and to create an interface with journalists so that they can have contacts with them. And for my PhD, I had preliminary contacts with the Ministry of Environment, the ADEME and the SHIFT project to try and disseminate our research findings and to discuss more generally acceptability issues. that's it for me. I'll stop the sharing.
Thank you very much for this additional presentation, Mathilde and Agnès. So we can start the roundtable. It is organized around 3 axes, starting with the first angle of approach of this late morning, scientific posture and decision making. So the first question is, which role and posture of scientists in political decisions, for example, on expertise? So Mathilde, do you want to begin to discuss?
Sure. This is a really interesting question. How should scientists have a link? And I'm being very general because this can be any type of links with institution. In my domain, at least, there are 2 types of questions that scientists ask when they study decision making and public policies. The first set of questions is, how can we make public policies more effective? So if you think of pollution, what are the best instruments to reduce pollution on a national scale, on a regional scale, et cetera, et cetera. So it's really about effectiveness, the first set of questions. And then the second set of questions, which are the ones I'm interested in as a researcher, are how can we make policies more acceptable? How can we respect more people's preferences towards policies? That relates also to what Mariam was saying about the acceptability of experiments, etc. So, for example, what I work on is how does acceptability vary for a carbon tax if you use certain type of designs over other designs? If you use the revenues to fund environmental projects, is this more in line with what people think a carbon tax should do? So it's really those 2 sets of questions that scientists can answer. And I think what's interesting as well is that for a long time, science on political decisions was not so widespread. I think that political decisions were considered, the sphere of ideologies and opinions, and it was not really consensual to try and do science about it. But I think it's really important that scientists also investigate these questions because expertise on policymaking is essential. Although then policymakers can choose not to follow scientists' results. I mean, it's up to them then to use these results to make better policies. But yeah, I would say in my domain, that's how the scientific posture is.
Thank you very much. So Mathilde discussed the acceptability of the scientific measure and the institutional posture behind this scientific measure. So maybe Agnès, do you want to complete this point with the scientific postures in expertise?
Yeah, sure. I mean, expertise is a pillar and a key mission of the French Reference Center for Animal Welfare. So I can only say that it's very much relevant to policy making. And the work carried out by the center here is really to bring experts together to provide collective expertise, consolidated data about the topic that is being raised. And answer the question relating to the welfare of animal. So for the center, it's welfare of animal and human management. And expertise is just different here from risk management or risk assessment, just to pinpoint this here. And what is of particular interest at the center is that when it comes to animal welfare, it's quite a relatively new science, let's say, in a way, or at least topic, and it brings many different scientific disciplines together. And so the aim here is to really bring those experts together, come up with an answer for policymakers. And this can be, and this would lead to, maybe some of you are familiar with this, to scientific opinions. And we make sure that also these opinions, whenever it's possible, are made available to the public, so that also the public or professionals that are not directly working on the expertise can have access to it and get and be aware of it and be informed of it. Maybe one thing that is interesting here is the fact that also maybe a bit beyond expertise, but science is not objective, science is not neutral. And so there is also a matter of science being made, reviewed, listened to by humans with their own opinions and knowledge. Especially knowledge. So I think it also comes down to the knowledge that is available, also being aware of what is not known yet. So knowledge in the making or knowledge in the making in a later future. And that is also of interest when it comes to expertise.
Yes, I completely agree. And just to bounce up on the role that citizens can play or the public can play in expertise in the environmental topics, there was the Convention citoyenne pour le climat, right, in which it was a first very interesting instance of citizens participating actively to try and design measures that they think both are effective and acceptable. So I think we also trying to find new ways to design policies, and this is not just the traditional policymaker just theorizing the thing and making the policy. It has to include both experts but also the public. I completely agree with what Agnes said.
Thanks to both of you. It's really insightful. It as we can hear already, it raises not only scientific questions but also philosophical questions and questions related to democracy, for instance. Yeah, who has the right to talk about some issues? Is it only the experts? Who are the experts, scientific or not? And all these relationships with the different decision makers are really interesting. If we come back to the researcher's role in all of that, sometimes it happens that they may disagree with the decision makers. So what's, in your opinion, can be the consequences when researchers publicly criticize policymakers' decisions?
I mean, I can start if you want. I think it's healthy in a way. It's part of the debate, and I believe that it can also foster new legislation or revised legislations. So in a way, this can be beneficial. Also keeping in mind that researchers, at least when talking about the field of animal welfare, and I believe it's the case in other fields as well, but they don't necessarily only work in institutes or agencies or labs. They can also work in other organizations like NGOs, for instance, and researchers on the same topic can have completely different opinions, and they can express their opinions in different ways. And for instance, we've seen researchers in NGOs fostering for petitions, for instance, for the legislation to change or to be improved. So I believe this is very much relevant here. And maybe another thing is also keeping in mind that researchers, although we of course, when it comes to interdisciplinarity, researchers can work on, of course, bringing different disciplines together. But researchers or scientists, let's say, refer to a scientific method, a specific knowledge in a specific field that might not be relevant for other fields as well. So it's also to keep in mind that when it comes to criticism is who's speaking and what is the field of relevance of that of a researcher or group of researchers speaking. I think this is also quite of importance here. I'm thinking of like having this argument of authority of maybe someone's calling himself or herself a scientist and making a point one is not a subject matter expert. This is something also to keep in mind. And maybe going back to what we said, what was said before in the previous roundtables, like calling for critical thinking here from the audience, the citizens, or the society. I think this is also key to keep in mind.
Yes, I definitely agree. And I think as a researcher, and I think that's also one of the questions that is raised, you're both a scientist, but you're also a citizen as a person. And I guess you can have two forms of criticisms. You can criticize what, for example, governments do because of your research specifically that points to some limitations of current policies. And you should do this from a research perspective, and for example, in a paper that you publish discussing things, or but as Anya said, there are so many researchers who themselves then as citizens also well, wish to be actively engaged in trying to recommend either some policies or designs or other issues, because we're in a critical session, I mean, in theory, it should be easy to distinguish these two parts of you, the researcher's part and the citizen's part, but I think it's not so easy. First of all, you choose your research topics because you're influenced as a citizen with the topics that you like. In my case, I'm very concerned about environmental issues, and so I'm going to work on that as a researcher. So I guess also it brings this question of the point and indeed the viewpoint from which you're criticizing or recommending. It can be the other way around too, and trying to dissociate the scientist part from the citizen's part.
It's very interesting, and to me, this raises the question of the objectivity of science, because what is the link between scientist as a citizen and scientist as a scientist, a worker? So it's really interesting question. So if you have done with this part of the question, we can move on to the next part. I'm sorry, we are really constrained by the time.
It's perfect. I just wanted to add maybe something in my experience that can limit the biases that you can have as a citizen, because, well, you try to be objective, you have the scientific method that helps you, you're not expressing an opinion, you're really trying to test hypotheses on thousands of people to try to establish more objective facts. And there are more and more tools that are being developed to try and help researchers do this. And one that we use a lot in our field is pre-registration tools. So scientists, before they conduct their experiments, they issue a public document in which they say, I'm going to test this hypothesis, I'm going to do it following this analysis plan on that sample, et cetera, so that it's easier not, to try and implicitly change your analysis or your results depending on what you think as a citizen and what you would like to find in your data. So I think it's really good that more and more tools help researchers guarantee at least their objectivity. It's never perfect, but it's better than nothing.
And as mentioned by Agnès, the interdisciplinary could be a really good tool to assure the objectivity of a research. And the next step is about communication and scientific vulgarization, because we talk about a link between institution and policymaker and scientists, but they are not obviously the same language between the both. So is my question, should policymakers be trained in understanding sciences related to their field of decision making, and at the opposite, researchers should be trained to disseminate their knowledge? So, and Agnès, Mathilde, it's yours.
Sure, I can start. I mean, when it comes to policymakers understanding sciences, I think this is what also we referred to expertise earlier, and this is also what expertise is for in a way, and it's to providing up-to-date, consolidated scientific knowledge and to help policymakers like create, update or improve legislation. So I guess this is expertise here is one way to answer that question. And the other way around, I think one thing, maybe an example that I can give about the French Reference Center for Animal Welfare is that we made sure that the resources of the center are made available to the public. So it's mainly aimed at professionals, but we also wanted to make it available to the general public, so that it's also a way for the audiences to become familiar with the topic when it's a hot topic, let's say. And one thing that a tool that we created is a database, like a knowledge hub that we made available on the website. And we worked on a ontology of the database so that with a specific selection of keywords, so that you can search like a bit like a Google, like a search engine, you can Google on, enter keywords, and it comes up with a selection of scientific, technical, regulatory documents about animal welfare. And we designed the database so that it's usable to not only just scientists who are used to the massive scientific databases like the WOS or that kind of basis, but also we wanted it to be available and accessible to non-scientific audiences. So that's, we designed it with that in mind. So that's why, that's the reason why we selected specific keywords and maybe, again, non-scientific or non-scientific specific keywords, so that it's easily accessible to different audiences. And that is also part of the mission of the center, to disseminate, again, that knowledge about animal welfare.
I think it's so great that this kind of initiative exists.
I'll put the link in the chat, actually.
I would be really interested in looking at this database. I think, at least in my domain, to go back to the question, I think there's not enough emphasis on how to communicate your results when you're a researcher. At least in my master degree, I think now they want to push students to think about scientific vulgarization, but it's I mean, we are trained to write articles, critical essays, and it's really not the same thing to write a popularization article than to write a scientific article. So I think we're not trained enough in research studies, at least up to now. And the other way around, I think, is also true. I think policymakers are not maybe trained enough also about scientific findings, how to read scientific graphs, how to look about uncertainty in the error bars, for example, as well. But I mean, it's not easy if it's not included in your training. For example, a friend of mine who works at the Shift project, he always tells me, well, you know, people don't have the reflex of going to Google Scholar to find, you know, something that helps you in your lit review on the topic. I think what may be a solution, maybe in the short term, if you don't have time to train the different communities, is to have people who are scientists, experts on the one side, but who also work in an administration, making this link, this interface. For example, people who are used to all these scientific communities and the way it works. And they could, for example, create, I was thinking of this recently, 2-page summaries of articles translated in French, for example, in the French administration, because all the research is in English, and sometimes it's hard to make the link with French policymakers. So yeah, it would be really great to have an interface between scientists and policymakers to try and develop easier access to scientific findings.
Thanks to both of you. It's very interesting to see these examples and ideas around that. I'm under the impression that institutions have been talking more and more about opening science. And so maybe on the paper, at least there's this will, but it raises probably lots of challenges. So in your opinion, how can we open up science to society to share the knowledge and deal with these challenges? Mathilde, maybe if you want to start.
Yes, sure. That's a very difficult question. So I'm not sure I have an idea on the topic, but at least, yeah, I think at least on the scientist side, it would be really great to have another format than the format of scientific articles. I really think, I mean, we are under the impression that because it's public, it's available to anyone who searches this, but only people who are specialists in your domain are going to read your articles. So I really think we would need a platform in which you can put a shortened version of your articles and the more accessible versions. For example, for my master thesis, I created a note de synthèse of my work, which is 70 pages long, and no one is going to read 70 pages long on the social acceptability of the carbon tax. But having a 1 or 2 pages summary in French with clear recommendations, I think would be really great. I think the problem is that researchers don't have enough incentives to do this. I mean, it's up to their own will to disseminate their findings. I mean, except from the traditional publication process. So I think a first step would be to create incentives for researchers to disseminate their findings in an easy formatting way.
Thank you, Mathilde. What do you think, Agnès?
Yeah, I do agree with you. I think this is definitely a question being raised here for researchers. I think also another way to open up science, and I think this is something that is becoming quite familiar now, is things like participatory science, for instance, or participatory research. So to really include society or citizens in building or gaining scientific knowledge. I think this is one thing that can really help. And we mentioned training before. Of course, training is another way. Again, I mentioned that tool that we built at the center to again opening this and to really making it accessible and usable. Because I agree with Mathilde, there's no point in making it accessible if no one is looking at it or understanding it. So it's to also making it user friendly and sensible to the audiences, and maybe also to train, so not just policymakers but the society as a whole to become more familiar with these scientific methods beyond just scientific knowledge, but just really what is the scientific method here, and again to build critical thinking. I think this is key.
Thank you. It's really, really interesting, and to me it's raise up also the question of the evaluation of scientists, because how you said, Mathilde, not a lot of scientists have the opportunity to do some dissemination, and maybe because also there are not evaluation, there are not promotions of this part of the work. So it could be very interesting to think about what is the evaluation of scientists, but it's maybe a little outside of the box of our topic now, but if you want to react about that.
No, I completely agree. I think that beside the, traditional H index of publications, you should, have a multiple set of criteria that should count as good research and dissemination. So it can be participation to public events that try to disseminate your findings. I mean, all researchers do this because then they can exchange with people, but it's not rewarded enough, I think. Again, I really agree with you that there should be multiple criteria instead of one combined, one single index to evaluate researchers that could help promoting other kinds of actions, for example, so partnerships with institutions. I mean, it's still, again, up to researchers of their own will to create institutional partnerships, and this takes time. I mean, the time that you take in building these partnerships, you don't spend it on doing your traditional research experiments. So I really think that this should be accounted for in some way.
So we have one intervention possible. So we have two possibilities. So take the intervention now or at the end of the roundtable. Mathilde, Agnès, what is okay for you? What is your preference?
I'm happy either way.
Okay, so I think it's Mariam.
Yeah, Mariam Shamet, if you want to react. You can.
Hello, Camille. Thank you. Yeah, I have a lot of. I mean, I wrote down a lot of things that resonate completely with a lot of the work that we do. Specifically, what Mathilde was saying about what format you should try, like what is the format that will get the attention of policymakers or people who are going to implement the knowledge or the scientific recommendations. And so we've been working a lot on that as well. So I will share the report of the project that I mentioned earlier, and you will see that we're trying to find the right midway between keeping the scientific robustness and complexity of the task and putting all the details of what worked, what didn't work, what is significant, what isn't, but also for it to be sufficiently clear and interesting for policymakers. And I mean, I'm not giving any solutions here, but I just wanted to raise the fact that it's quite complicated to strike that balance, because on the cursor, if you have like basically, I don't know, scientists here and policymakers here, no matter where you go on the cursor, it's frustrating for one side or the other. But I think there is a bit of danger, and this is something that I've been quite scared of in the past 6 years of working in applied research. There's a quite of danger of also altering the rigor of science. So for example, in a lot of our experiments, we are faced with many challenges that are like time challenges or not being able to do the experiment in the most robust way, etc. So I don't consider that what I do right now is really science anymore, because it doesn't follow the conditions that you need to respect to do like pure, clean science. So one thing which we can think about is whether there shouldn't be these, I don't know, some hybrid structures. I think Mathilde was mentioning a bit earlier this idea, but having structures that are people who have scientific knowledge, but who accept that they're not doing science anymore per se, and who kind of play this role of, on the one hand, translating science for policymakers, but on the other hand, respecting something that scientists aren't too frustrated with, that it completely denatured their message. And maybe there's room for, like, I don't know, a whole body of, a body of translation of science to policymakers and to society. So maybe we should think of creating that kind of, I don't know, institution or space. At least it gives me motivation to try thinking about that. And I had one more thing to say, but I completely slipped my mind right now. I'll see if I remember and jump in a second.
Thank you a lot, Mariam. Maybe for the next step of our reflection, this roundtable is really linked with what you say now. It's about the link between institution and policymaker, the link between how policymaker could integrate the scientific opinion, scientific knowledge on their decision. When do you think that policymakers shouldn't listen to scientists, and why? So, Agnès, Mathilde, go ahead.
Maybe I can start. First of all, I do agree with Mariam, with what Mariam said, that the importance of this, I say, like the connecting roles between or bodies between science and policymakers, and these interfacing roles. I do agree. I think these are key also here in the matter. To answer your question, Annelise, I think, so when should policymakers not listening to scientists? I think, policymaking and science are two different things. And to me, policymaking relies on policymakers' decisions. So science can provide knowledge, but it's up to policymakers to make the decisions when it comes to policies, not scientific decisions. These are policymaking related decisions. And again, maybe something to keep in mind, and I think this was quite relevant when it comes to, for instance, the COVID crisis. It means we were in situations where, for instance, there were decisions to be made by authorities or policymakers. So sure, they can take scientific knowledge into account, but this is maybe not the only thing that is being to be taken into account when it comes to making decisions. Maybe there are financial matters, maybe they are logistical matters, maybe they are economic matters, and maybe they are also, and we raised a bit that question earlier, maybe there are also ethical matters or moral matters to have in mind when making those decisions. So I think, again, scientific knowledge is different from policy making, really, and yeah, maybe I need Mathilde if you want to add something else.
No, I completely agree with what has been said. I think that as a scientist, you know, when you're doing your study, you try to isolate variables, you try to act only on them to find a causal pathway between your variable and an outcome of interest. And I mean, it's your role to produce this robustness only on some variables, but policymakers have to take into account so many variables. So again, they have to combine different constraints, as have been said, different imperatives. I also think that there are situations in which the research is very recent. In my case, social acceptability research is very recent. So how do you base your decisions when the studies have only started, I don't know, 10 or 20 years ago, when also it's only conducted in some countries rather than in a lot of different countries, different contexts, and science is full of nuance. Also, you have studies that find significant effects, you have studies that don't find them. Of course, it's the role of scientists to say this seems to be a robust result in the literature because it has been replicated many times. But where, again, do you find this cursor that Mariam was alluding to? When do you decide that this is a robust enough finding, or that you think you can base your decisions on that finding? So sorry, I raised more questions than I answered, but I think all of this creates a trade-offs for policymakers and scientists.
Yeah, I do agree. It's also a matter of priorities. What do you prioritize when it comes to policy making? And for instance, for animal welfare, there's the question of animal welfare also depends on, of course, physical health, but of course, mental health as well. So should we prioritize mental health over physical health? This has more to do with maybe values, more values, and also cultures in a way, and scientists are also, as I mentioned before, they also they have their own scientific background and cultural background in a way. So this is also something to keep in mind, and that is different from, again, from policy making.
Just to jump on that, sorry, I just remembered what I wanted to say earlier, and it nicely follows up what was just said. I think one other challenge is also what scientists do you bring to the table, and because each scientist, I mean, depending on the field that the scientist is coming from, there might be different views, and that has direct impact on the policies. So let me give you an example. We were talking earlier about DGCCRF and like market control and fraud regulation, etc. So imagine the DGCCRF has an evolutionary psychologist as an advisor, and this evolutionary psychologist is working on sugar and sugar addiction. And so imagine the view of the evolutionary psychologist is that given that we're all extremely addicted to sugar, and that it's something that is so ingrained in humans and that has been there for ages, and it's going to be very difficult to lutter contre the sugar addiction. So I, as an evolutionary psychologist, would recommend to the DGCCRF to use banning policies and ban the amount of sugar in drinks, for example, in sodas or coca or whatever, because I know that policies such as information or like informational campaigns or any other types of policy tools will not work because people can't fight this addiction. So this means that as an evolutionary psychologist, you're going to have very different recommendations to the policymakers than if you are someone who works in other fields that are not evolutionary psychology and who think that, I don't know, if they take someone who works on ad campaigns, they're going to work much more on informational levers. Or for example, if you're a neurodevelopmental scientist and you work with the directorate that regulates drug use, you might recommend to the state to do interventions that specifically target children from the age of 8 to 12, because above that time frame, the addiction, addiction will, if children are exposed to, I don't know, screens or drugs or whatever is addictive, it will be much harder for them to get de-addicted. So what I'm trying to, I'm just giving examples to show you that depending also on the scientists you bring and their fields and their hats, they're going to have very different recommendations to policymakers. So how do we regulate which scientists we listen to? Do we bring on many scientists and we do an average? I mean, it's complicated. These questions also raise a lot of questions, which again, like Camille, are more questions than answers. But I think we should talk about these things in the future because they have direct impacts on all of our lives.
Thank you, Mariam. This is great to lead us to the conclusion. We can ask ourselves that question: who did we bring today? Do we have a good representation of the different sciences, and what impact will it have? So thank you very much for our speaker and for the remarks, Mariam. And Liz, if you want to say the last words for this roundtable, and then we can finish the half day.
Thank you very much for your participation, for your very, very interesting discussion. Thank you, Mariam, to join us to this roundtable. And maybe I think Naila have some words to conclude the morning, but we can keep in contact to discuss about all these very, very important points. So thank you very much.